Hey everyone, Danny here. Thank you so much for tuning in. This is episode number 319. Thank you for joining in as we are continuing our study in the book of John. Today's episode, chapter 19 in the book of John. So let's just jump right in. It says, "So then Pilate took Jesus and scourged him." That is a whipped him. And the soldiers twisted a crown of thorns and put it on his head, and they put on him a purple robe. Then they said, "Hail, King of the Jews!" And they struck him with their hands. Pilate then went out again and said to them, "Behold, I am bringing him out to you, that you may know that I find no fault in him." Then Jesus came out wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe. And Pilate said to them, "Behold the man." Therefore, when the chief priests and officers saw him, they cried out, saying, "Crucify him, crucify him." Pilate said to them, "You take him and crucify him, for I find no fault in him." I do want to point out here, and I think it is helpful or useful to notice. There we read that when the chief priests and the officers saw him, they cried out, "Crucify him." This is a much different picture than oftentimes what we go to in our thinking. It's a much different scene than we find before, not long prior. Jesus is having his triumphant entry into Jerusalem, and people are shouting out, "Hosanna, Hosanna in the highest." A lot of times it gets told that the same people that are shouting "Crucify him" were the ones who were proclaiming Hosanna. And while that's not outside the realm of possibility, we do see here explicitly told to us that it was the chief priests and officers saying, "Crucify him." We know that the religious leaders, those leaders of the temple, the way of the temple, they wanted rid of this Jesus, and so we see here that it is they who are proclaiming, "Crucify him." So I think that's important to note. Does that distinction make a difference? Maybe it doesn't, but I think it is helpful in the sense of knowing who is it exactly, to the best that we can point out who is advocating for this to transpire. And regardless of who was advocating for it, Jesus was about his mission, and he was seeking to accomplish the purpose to which he was sent, the purpose to which the Father had sent him. So regardless of who was advocating for this particular moment, I do think it is helpful and interesting to observe those specific ones. And then, again, tying back to these religious leaders of his day. Verse 7, "The Jews answered him, 'We have a law, and according to our law he ought to die, because he made himself the Son of God.' Therefore, when Pilate heard that saying, he was the more afraid, and went again into the praetorium and said to Jesus, 'Where are you from?' But Jesus gave him no answer. Then Pilate said to him, 'Are you not speaking to me? Do you not know that I have power to crucify you and power to release you?' Jesus answered, "You could have no power at all against me unless it had been given you from above. Therefore, the one who delivered me to you has the greater sin." I think that's also an interesting thing to consider. Jesus says that he could have no power unless it had been given to him from above. So that kind of helps us to remember, to remind ourselves that the things that we face, the even obstacles, the situations that come before us, we should rest assured that nothing is coming our way that God has not allowed to come our way. Now, all of us face varying types of situations, of obstacles. Some are extremely hard and difficult and painful and traumatic, and we can't necessarily quite understand why these things happen. But we should, even in the midst of Jesus' most darkest time, this place in which he would ultimately face crucifixion, this power, as he clarified to Pilate, had been given to him because God had ordained it to be so. So I think we all ought to remind ourselves that the things that we face, it is not taking God by surprise, and that if it is there, he has allowed it to be so. Verse 12, "From then on Pilate sought to release him, but the Jews cried out, saying, 'If you let this man go, you are not Caesar's friend. Whoever makes himself a king speaks against Caesar.' When Pilate therefore heard that saying, he brought Jesus out and sat down in the judgment seat in a place that is called the Pavement, but in Hebrew, Gabbatha." I do want to point out there, that was a very politically charged statement. They are playing that against him. If you let this man go, you're not Caesar's friend. That was a very politically charged, and of course there is this spiritual component to it, and there is a political component to it, and that was really the thing that drove Pilate to really fold in that moment. It was a very politically aimed target. Now, verse 14. "Now it was the preparation day of the Passover, and about the 6th hour. And he said to the Jews, 'Behold your king.' But they cried out, 'Away with him, away with him, crucify him.' Pilate said to them, 'Shall I crucify your king?' The chief priests answered," there it is again, "the chief priests answered, 'We have no king but Caesar.' Then he delivered him to them to be crucified. Then they took Jesus and led him away." Again, that is a different scene than oftentimes what we picture. The very ones who were proclaiming his name are the ones now condemning his name. Now that does happen. That does unfortunately occur. Your friends one minute can be your enemies the very next minute. But here, in the context of what happened to Jesus, we see explicitly the chief priests answered, "We have no king but Caesar." Verse 17, "And he," speaking of Jesus, "bearing his cross, went out to a place called the place of the skull, which is called in Hebrew Golgotha, where they crucified him and 2 others with him, one on either side and Jesus in the center. Now Pilate wrote a title and put it on the cross, and the writing was, 'Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews.' Then many of the Jews read this title, for the place where Jesus was crucified was near the city, and it was written in Hebrew, Greek, and Latin. Therefore the chief priests of the Jews said to Pilate, "Do not write the King of the Jews, but he said, 'I am the King of the Jews.'" Pilate answered, "What I have written, I have written." Then the soldiers, when they had crucified Jesus, took his garments and made 4 parts, to each soldier a part, and also the tunic. Now the tunic was without seam, woven from the top in one place, in one piece. They said, therefore, among themselves, "Let us not tear it, but cast lots for it, whose it shall be, that the scripture might be fulfilled, which says, 'They divided my garments among them, and for my clothing they cast lots.' Therefore the soldiers did these things. Now there stood by the cross of Jesus his mother, and his mother's sister, Mary, the wife of Clopas, and also Mary Magdalene. When Jesus therefore saw his mother and the disciple whom he loved, now we know that to be John, standing by, he said to his mother, "Woman, behold your son." And then he said to the disciple, "Behold your mother." And from that hour, that disciple took her to his own home. I'll pause here because I think this is this is, 3 verses? But I believe so much is contained within those verses. The weight of respect that Jesus had for John, to be willing to essentially give his mother to John, to say, "Behold, this is your mother now," and to say to his mother, "This is your son now." The mutual respect that you would have. He cared for John and he cared for his mother, and so he wanted to bridge these two together. Yes, John was a regular person, just like you and I. Mary was a regular person like you and I. Obviously, you or I have not had an immaculate conception, so she was special in that regard. But she was a human. She was a woman. He was, John, a human, a man. But the trust that Jesus had for both of them, to give them one another, that's a serious, a major amount of trust and care that he would grant to John, to take care of his own mother. Moving on, verse 28, after this, Jesus, knowing that all things were now accomplished, that the scripture might be fulfilled, said, "I thirst." Now a vessel full of sour wine was sitting there, and they filled a sponge with sour wine, put it on hyssop, and put it in his mouth. So when Jesus had received the sour wine, he said, "It is finished." And bowing his head, he gave up his spirit. I think that is very intentional language. I know some people that I've just talked to in the past, just personal friendships. Many times, some of them will have issues with this idea of how could mankind kill God. And this is something that's strange to consider. Yes, they took his life from him in the sense of killing him on a cross. We have to keep in mind that Jesus did take on flesh. So in that, he had limitations, and he had to function and operate within the parameters of human flesh. So there were limitations on him in that regard. But Jesus we read elsewhere, no one takes my life from me, I lay it down, Jesus says. And we see that here in verse 30. He bows his head and he gives up his spirit. So I think that is actually kind of a better way to think, that Jesus laid his life down. The strain and the injury that he withstood in the process of the cross, and even the moments before when he was getting beaten and whipped, his body took a physical toll, and just the strain on his heart, his lungs, all the fluid that was building up. When blood and water pours from his pierced side, we see that here in just a minute. These were all physiological things that are happening to him, and so yes, this is at the hand of humanity. And so in that sense, we took the life of the incarnated God. But we see here also explicitly that he gave up his spirit. And so I think that is something to consider, and I think something that also helps us to reconcile that dynamic of God and flesh, and how he gave his life as a substitution for us. Verse 31, therefore, because it was the preparation day, that the bodies should not remain on the cross on the Sabbath, for that Sabbath was a high day, the Jews asked Pilate that their legs might be broken and that they might be taken away. Then the soldiers came and broke the legs of the first and the other who was crucified with him. But when they came to Jesus and saw that he was already dead, they did not break his legs. But one of the soldiers pierced his side with a spear, and immediately blood and water came out. And he who has seen has testified, and his testimony is true, and he knows that he is telling the truth, so that you may believe. Notice that this is what John is after. He is testifying to what he has seen, so that we who read may believe. Verse 36, for these things were done, that the scripture should be fulfilled. Not one of his bones shall be broken. And again, another scripture says, they shall look on him whom they pierced. After this, Joseph of Arimathea, being a disciple of Jesus, but secretly, for fear of the Jews, asked Pilate that he might take away the body of Jesus. And Pilate gave him permission, so he came and took the body of Jesus. And Nicodemus, who at first came to Jesus by night, also came, bringing a mixture of myrrh and aloes, about 100 pounds. Then they took the body of Jesus and bound it in strips of linen with the spices, as the custom of the Jews is to bury. Now in the place where he was crucified there was a garden, and in the garden a new tomb, in which no one had yet been laid. So there they laid Jesus, because of the Jews' preparation day, for the tomb was nearby. I've considered this before, and I believe I have spoken to it, but I want to just mention it here lastly before we end. I think it's interesting, and I can't help but think, no coincidence, as though prophetic kind of nod to, I don't think that's necessarily the right words, perhaps an honorarium, to honor the memory of Joseph. We know, as it relates to his earthly father, we think of Joseph, as the one who raised Jesus, and this man who comes and kind of in a way puts Jesus into this tomb, almost in a sense laying him down to sleep. And this man, Joseph of Arimathea, shares a name similar, Joseph, with as his father's name. I think that by this point we know Joseph was no longer alive. So I can't help but see this as kind of as an honoring of the memory of his father. But this man, Joseph of Arimathea, takes Jesus, and also with the help of Nicodemus, they took Jesus' body and prepared it for the burial. I think it's also no coincidence that the place in which he was crucified was a garden. We can think back to kind of our introduction into Scripture in Genesis. There's a garden that God plants, and he places the man in the garden. I can't help but see the connection between the man in the garden, and here we see Jesus, the man, being laid in the garden, in a tomb, in strips of linen. I can't help but see the strips, the swaddling clothes that Jesus would have been wrapped in as a baby. Now we see him being placed in strips of linen, in his burial garment. So I see many veins and connection points between different places in Scripture, and always this pointing to the person of Jesus and things that he would do and accomplish in and for each and every one of us who would put our faith and trust in him. So this will end our chapter 19 in the book of John. Thank you so much for being with me. Hope these are helpful and encouraging to you. Please help share these episodes with friends and family, loved ones, people, strangers that you don't know, so we can get the word out to as many people so that they too may hear and see and believe in the one who has offered life to those who would have it. So thank you for being with me. I look forward to the next episode. God bless.